We're on Lesson 7, Matthew chapters 14 through 17. These chapters are often called the period of retirements. Previous to this, most of Jesus' ministry was in Galilee. As his crucifixion began to draw nearer, he wanted to get away from the crowds, and he wanted to spend more alone time with the disciples. And so in these chapters, Jesus began withdrawing to areas outside of Galilee. Let me get a map up here. I'll just go through the key places from the outset here and not try to mingle them in with the text. Chapter 14, verse 13 is the first reference where it's called a deserted place. The parallel account in Luke chapter 9, verse 10 tells us that Jesus went into a deserted place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. Let me look on the map down here. Here's Bethsaida. This is all, several of these references, the first ones will be around the Sea of Galilee. And this is the first one here. So the feeding of the 5,000, which is what's under discussion, took place near Bethsaida there on the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Chapter 14, verse 34 is the next reference. It mentions he went to the land of Gennesaret, and that's over here on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, another little town located along the shore. Chapter 15, verse 21 is where it takes us outside of Galilee. It mentions Tyre and Sidon, chapter 15, verse 21. Tyre is here about 30 miles northwest of Capernaum as a crow flies. And then Sidon is another 20-ish, 25, 30 miles north of Tyre. This Zarephath was in between those two towns. That's the the reference there in 15:21. In chapter 15, verse 29, Jesus had returned back to Galilee. It mentions that he skirted the Sea of Galilee. Let me get my cursor up here. There it is. That he skirted the Sea of Galilee and went up on a mountain. And as you see with the topographical map here, there are a lot of mountains in the area there. It's uncertain as to which one. Then chapter 16, verse 13 is when he goes north about 32 miles up to Caesarea Philippi. This is where the confession was made, where he asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And then Peter confessed him as the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's chapter 16, verse 13. The next key place is in chapter 17, verse 1, which is the Mount of Transfiguration. This map here doesn't show it. It's generally accepted that Mount Hermon is where the Transfiguration took place. Mount Hermon is one of these mountains right here, a very high mountain, just north of Caesarea. This is a different map, of course, which shows Caesarea and Mount Hermon here. It gives the identification of it there. Chapter 17, verse 24. After that occurrence north, and make their way back to Capernaum. That's the reference there. So those are the key places that are referred to in the text, or in the material, I'm sorry. Now we begin with the questions. Question 1 says, explain why and how John the Baptizer was executed. This account is found in chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. The principal characters in this account are Herod Antipas, Herodias, his legal wife, and John the Baptizer. Herod Antipas was ruler of Perea in Galilee. I don't have a map that goes down far enough, but Perea was on the east side of the Jordan River, south of the Sea of Galilee, and John baptized in the Jordan River, which was on the very western boundary of Perea. Herodias was married to Herod's half-brother initially. His name was Philip, but Herod divorced his first wife and then married Herodias. This was unlawful, and John made this quite clear in his teaching. This upset Herodias, and she wanted John put to death. On Herod's birthday, Herodias' daughter danced and pleased Herod so much that he offered her anything up to half his kingdom. She asked for the head of John the Baptizer on a platter, and her request was granted. Question number 2 says, what prompts Jesus to perform the miracle of feeding the 5,000? And the reference there is to chapter 14, verse 14, which the account goes on through verse 21. The text tells us that multitudes had followed him from the cities. They had come to listen to him teach, and finally it was evening, and Jesus' disciples observed that they were in a deserted place, and that it was very late, and the people had not eaten. People, of course, were in need of physical sustenance, and Jesus supplied it by multiplying loaves of bread and fish, enough to feed 5,000 men, plus women and children, the text tells us. Again, question 2 says, what prompts Jesus to perform the miracle of feeding the 5,000? Verse 14 is the reference given, and this verse tells us that Jesus was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. Recognizing their hunger later that day, I'm confident that Jesus' compassion is also what moved him to feed them at that time. Question number 3 says, why did Jesus send the disciples ahead of him in the boat? Chapter 14, verse 23. Jesus did this after having fed the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels. And John's Gospel gives us some insights that the others do not. In John chapter 6, we're told that multitudes came and wanted to make Jesus a king after he performed that miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Seems that this was the compelling reason as to why Jesus sent the disciples ahead of him. However, he could have gone with them, but he chose not to. Chapter 14, verses 22 and 23 tells us that he sent the disciples away, then he sent the multitudes away, and then he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. Seems evident that he sent them all away in order to be alone to pray. Popularity can cause as many problems as conflict. Question 4 says, what warning does Jesus give regarding man-made traditions? In chapter 15, verses 3 through 6, Jesus made the accurate observation that any time man-made traditions enter the picture in religion, the traditions of men always end up taking precedent over the teachings of God. In verse 6, Jesus said, you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Question 5 asks, who received the glory for Jesus' miracles? And it refers to chapter 15, verse 31. That verse says, so the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Question 6 says, what ongoing problem does Jesus call on his disciples to address in chapter 14, verse 31 and chapter 16, verse 8? He addresses the problem of them having little faith. In chapter 14, verse 31, he said, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Chapter 16, verse 8, Jesus said, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Little faith focuses on problems rather than on solutions. Question 7 says, why is confessing our faith in Jesus important? Well, to refuse to confess reveals shame and lack of courage. Honest confession is a form of commitment, and it strengthens one's conviction. Question number 8 says, what is at stake in our decision to follow Jesus? And it refers to, or I'll refer to chapter 16, verses 24 through 28. It says, then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. Well, he gives that reference. I stop at verse 26. He said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Question 8 again says, what is at stake in our decision to follow Jesus? The short answer is our very souls are at stake. Question number 9 asks, what is the significance of Moses and Elijah's appearance on the mountain with Jesus? This is talking about the transfiguration. I'm not really sure. That's my answer, my brief answer. Some see Moses and Elijah representing the law and the prophets. It can also be pointed out that both were associated with the time of the Messiah. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, God said he would raise up a prophet like Moses, and all people would have to listen to him or be held accountable. And in Malachi, God said that the return of Elijah would precede the Messiah. Then there's the fact that both Moses and Elijah had what we might call unusual deaths, but their deaths were significantly different from Christ's death. I'm not sure it answers the question, but Luke chapter 9 verse 31 indicates that Moses and Elijah were there possibly to strengthen Jesus regarding what he was about to face. The text says they were talking to Jesus about his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Question 10 says, how do Jesus' responses in chapter 15 verses 15 through 20 and in chapter 17 verses 24 through 27 each perfectly address the situation? In chapter 15 verses 15 through 20, the scribes and Pharisees were more concerned about being ritually clean regarding what they put in their mouth than they were concerned about what was in their hearts. In chapter 17 verses 24 through 27, Jesus showed his omniscience by revealing what he knew of a private conversation Peter had just had before entering the house. And Jesus showed his omnipotence by miraculously providing a coin in the mouth of a fish that Peter would catch out of the sea. And Jesus made it clear that the temple belonged to his Father, God. Yet he also made it clear that in order to be obedient to God and not to offend men, he would follow the laws of men even when he was exempt from them. Application 11 says, I admire and will imitate Jesus' example of being compassionate toward those who are in need. Application 12 says, to better follow Jesus, I will place more emphasis on the internal than on the external. Application 13, something I will tell others about Jesus is that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Then he encourages us to pray for growing loyalty to Jesus and for protection from the influence of false teachings. And he says, pray that our minds will be set upon the interests of God.